In my last video, we discussed the testimony of Diddy's longtime girlfriend, Cassie. Now, while her testimony was full of salacious details about their sexual swinging lifestyle and his history of physical abuse, in my assessment, it was short on any evidence to suggest that she was a victim of sexual trafficking. After Cassie, the prosecutors have presented two more witnesses they claim were victims of Diddy's sex trafficking. Well, did they deliver? Join me into a legal deep dive on the continued testimony of the prosecution's witnesses against Diddy for sex trafficking. In our last discussion of the Diddy trial, we discussed my take on the testimony of Diddy's former girlfriend, Cassie, who he was in a long-term relationship with. It was my assessment that although her testimony was full of lurid, salacious details about their swinging, sex-fueled lifestyle, and of course, a history of physical violence and abuse by Diddy, I felt that her testimony was really short on evidence of any real sex trafficking with regard to her testimony. Since then, the prosecution has presented the testimony of two more witnesses which they claim provide evidence that Diddy was engaged in sex trafficking. How did that testimony work out? Join me in a legal deep dive and let's see. What's good, people? Let's talk about the next two prosecution witnesses that have relationships with Diddy and claim to be victims of sex trafficking. Jane Doe and Mia. You may notice I describe them as witnesses, not victims, and use the word relationship to describe their interactions with Diddy. And I chose those words intentionally because after listening to their testimony, it is very clear that they were in consensual, albeit abusive relationships with Diddy of their own choice. And before I get into the details of their testimony, I'm going to repeat what I said about the prosecution starting their case with Cassie. I think it was a mistake to lead their case and frame their trafficking case with these women. These women were not underage homeless girls. They were not drugged or blackmailed. These are all adult women that made a conscious choice, an ongoing choice, to stay in a relationship with a man that expected them to engage in sex-fueled hotel sex parties and who was physically abusive. And they did that because that man was rich and famous and powerful, and they all stayed in these relationships until they chose to leave. And anyone that tries to suggest it was something different is an idiot. If Diddy was not a rich and powerful billionaire, if he was a manager of a Jiffy Lube, I can guarantee you those women would not have tolerated his abusive behavior and would not have engaged in his sexual demands. I challenge anyone to say otherwise. And I know I sound insensitive, but let's go ahead and break down the testimony. First, we're going to start with the testimony of his assistant, Mia. Now, Mia worked as Diddy's assistant for 8 years, during which time she would claim she was sexually assaulted on multiple occasions. Now, what immediately comes to mind is, why did she stay with him for 8 years? Could she not find another job? Does anyone believe that makes sense? Does anyone believe that she did not have options or she did not have a choice? And I keep going back to that word choice, and you hear me talking about choice because, again, sex trafficking has to do with the lack of a choice of a person. When Diddy was under investigation, she was interviewed by federal prosecutors for 6 months. During that time, when she knew that he was being investigated for sex trafficking, she never mentioned any claim about being sexually assaulted. She only mentioned being sexually assaulted after Cassie filed her lawsuit. So again, she interviewed federal investigators for 6 months, understanding he was under investigation for sex trafficking, and never ever made allegations that she was sexually assaulted. And when you look at that along with her additional conduct, 3 years after she stopped working for Diddy, she stayed in touch with him. She was still sending him texts telling him she loved him and she missed him. She sent him texts telling him that she saw his Netflix documentary was doing well and how much she loved him still. And he responded saying how much he loved her, and she would say literally, "I love, 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 love you." On his birthday, 14 days before he got arrested, she sent him a picture of him and her together. And I say to you, that type of conduct, years after she left the relationship, cannot be reconciled with someone who claims to be a victim of sex trafficking. And when asked about why she would send these texts, when she was asked on cross-examination about all these texts she sent for years after the relationship ended, what was her response? She was brainwashed. Well, I'm sure she was, by dollar signs and VIP tables at the Grammy Awards. The next witness the prosecution put on the witness stand was Jane Doe, who was in a self-described love contract with Diddy, where he agreed to pay her $10,000 a month. A contract. I'm going to put on my legal hat for just a minute and remind you what a contract is. A contract is an agreement. An agreement. You know how they say a person knew what they signed up for? Well, this person literally knew what she signed up for because they had a contract. And I know that I'm not the smartest lawyer, but how does a person enter into an agreement to take $10,000 a month in a love contract, yet at the same time testify they were a victim of sex trafficking? Now, she did testify that she really didn't want to engage in the hotel freak-offs with Diddy. She wanted to be in a normal relationship with him. However, she felt obligated to participate because he was paying her rent. And you know, you hear me say it all the time, let's talk about choice. I kind of think she had another option. It's called getting a job and paying your own rent. Most people do that. In addition to paying her $10,000 a month in rent, she also testified he paid for her veneers because she didn't like her teeth. And once she got in trouble and needed lawyers, he paid her legal fees. And here's the kicker. Here's the real kicker. As she sat on the witness stand and testified against him, she testified he was still paying her $10,000 a month and paying her rent. And she was dating him up until the time he got arrested. And I really don't understand how the prosecution take this woman who's still receiving $10,000 a month from the defendant, who's in a love contract with him, and put that person on the witness stand and try to present her as a victim of sex trafficking. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, even the text messages between the two of them and her testimony was such that, just like Cassie, she wanted to be the only one. She wanted to be in a relationship with him. You know, she would get jealous when he would go to Turks and Caicos with other women and get upset with him. She testified that whenever she would complain, he would get tired of her complaining and suggest that they end the relationship, and then she would get hurt that he wants to end the relationship. That's not a victim. A sex trafficking victim does not get upset when the abuser wants to end the relationship. And she also testified about domestic violence between the two. In her case, based on her own testimony, she was someone that initiated a lot of the domestic violence against him. She testified that she took his head and slammed it against a marble countertop in the house he was paying for, and he would fight her and hit her in return. And it was an ongoing thing between the two of them. It wasn't a situation where she was the sole recipient of the physical abuse and violence in the relationship. Again, you have a woman that made a choice, a willing participant. She decided she could take the $10,000 a month and be a part of a swinging lifestyle and put up with his craziness and his chaotic lifestyle in exchange for the money. That's a choice she made. And the funny thing about the hotel freak-offs, not only did she also set them up on her own, but she also, according to her testimony, she got on a private jet with a different rapper and went to a different hotel freak-off without Diddy's knowledge. She admits she took drugs, but she says she took the drugs voluntarily because it made participation in the sexual freak-offs a lot easier to manage and deal with. In her text messages, she talks about wanting quality time with him. Again, what victim of sex trafficking wants quality time with her abuser? In what universe does that happen? I'm going to call it like I see it. Just like Cassie, neither of these women were victims of sex trafficking. In fact, I believe calling these women victims of sex trafficking is offensive to real victims of sex trafficking. These women were not young, homeless, runaway teens that were drugged up and taken advantage of. These women were not women that were smuggled across the border and taken advantage of and traded like commodities for sex. Victims of sex traffickers do not receive $10,000 a month allowances and go to red carpet events. And they certainly don't negotiate $20 million book deals with their abuser. And they certainly don't negotiate $20 million deals not to write tell-all books with their abuser. To present these women as victims of sex trafficking is a joke. You might agree with me, or you might not like what I'm saying. I really don't give a damn. Either way, do me a favor, post your comments, and call it like you see it. That's it. Well, that's all I got, but I do appreciate you taking the time to join me on this legal deep dive. I think it's always fun to discuss these topics, tell you what I think, and get your feedback. I would really appreciate it if you took the time to like the video, subscribe to the podcast, and also I'd appreciate you sending me your comments so we can discuss the topics you want to hear about. That's it.